Hello everyone, welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Hembar, and today I'm going to be doing another fantasy essay video since it's been a couple months. And this one actually is going to be on the essay, which has a funny name, How Tolkien Ruined Fantasy by none other than Brandon Sanderson. In fact, okay, now I'm actually ready to discuss this. Now, this is an essay that is rather old and also kind of has a triggering title. But it's not that bad actually in some ways. So it is from 2005, I believe. Again, originally it's called How Tolkien Ruined Fantasy. It's eulogy number 17. He did retitle it. Actually, I Don't Hate Tolkien because a lot of people apparently were getting mad without reading the actual essay. Now, it is insanely short to take you a couple minutes to read. But it is actually pretty interesting. So I'm gonna just read through it and leave comments essentially as I read through it. And I thought, some of you might be interested in it. I did find it, or actually my friend Karth, if you're watching this, Karth, I found it on the Wayback Machine. You cannot find it on Brandon Sanderson's website anymore. But again, he changed it. I believe this says August 2005. He says he doesn't hate Tolkien. He didn't want to be aligned with a camp of Tolkien haters, and that he thinks he's a master writer. But anyways, let's get to the actual article. It says the publication of Lord of the Rings was perhaps the worst thing that has ever happened to fantasy literature, which he's definitely hooking you right in. Now you may assume I'm just making the statement to be inflammatory and controversial. You're only half right. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I honestly think that Lord of the Rings did some pretty awful things to fantasy. Not that Tolkien's writing was bad, quite the opposite, actually. Let's look at the literary climate of the period. We had Narnia, of course, and though Howard hadn't published many Conan books, he'd written about the character in short story form. There was also some very good dark fantasy being published in the pulps. However, almost all these works shared a single attribute. They were what we call low fantasy. In other words, they were all related somehow to this world. High fantasy that takes place in a completely different world, had yet to come to its own. This format has since become the standard mainstay of the genre, but the early fledgling fantasy stories were still associated strongly with science fiction, mythology, and fairy tales. These roots tied the stories back to this world. Now, that's interesting. He's pretty accurate here, actually. First thing, I like how he mentions Robert E. Howard, who is the author of Conan, as he mentions. A lot of fantasy readers, I'm not sure so much writers, I hope the writers don't forget Howard, but a lot of readers tend to forget that he exists, right? And you had, of course, Narnia, but that is very much children's literature as well. And you have a lot of stuff, right? Tolkien or Sanderson here does not mention a lot, all right? He just mentions Narnia and he mentions Conan. That's it, right? And they are low fantasy, technically, right? I mean, Narnia is portal fantasy, or isekai if you're cool, I guess. Anyways, the Hyborian Age is technically before our history. It's basically prehistory. But Middle Earth is as well. And now I realize we generally give the label high fantasy to Middle Earth, and it deserves it. But it is technically the same thing. It is just very far in the past. It's antediluvian. It's mythic, right? But it is still technically, by that definition, low fantasy. But I would still call it high fantasy, right? So, but he's right though. I mean, you have other fantasies at this time, right? And so like a lot of Clark Ashton Smith stuff is connected to our world in some way. It's going to different planets, but it's planets that exist, right? Planetary romance, it's on Mars, right? It's on Venus. You have things like even the King of Elfland's Daughter, which is kind of in rural England. You have the Broken Sword, which is also in England. So you do have stuff that is essentially, it's almost always tied to this world. That's not generally the case, though. In fact, Tolkien probably got this idea, which again, his isn't completely secondary world, but it is essentially from someone like William Morris, who you could point to his novel or his prose romance, as he called them, The Story of the Glittering Plain, which is completely secondary world. At least there's nothing in it that seems to connect it to our world. Now, that's his third prose romance. The first two are very obviously connected to our world, right? So, and Tolkien was a fan of Morris as well. So Then let's continue, I guess. Let's see. Then Tolkien came along and published the greatest work of high fantasy ever written. He's not wrong. He's correct here. I'd say he was about 50 years ahead of his time. I don't know. Sure. And since the novel genre itself is only about 2.5 centuries old, I hear that. At least as well comparatively. I'd say the publishing Lord of the Rings was a caveman discovering how to make a light bulb while his powers was still working on making how to make fire. The whole novel thing is not worth talking about here, but yeah, essentially caught lightning in a jar. That's basically what he's saying. Now, we're gonna get into this, so I'm not gonna comment much on it now, but because Sanderson gets into it, so he's like, I just don't think we were ready for Lord of the Rings. He says, by analogy, let's continue with the caveman metaphor. What could society have lost if we'd skipped directly to the electrical age? Centuries spent learning, being creative, practicing innovation. Centuries that essentially we spent preparing ourselves to use the technology when we found it. Simply by being so amazingly good at what he did, Tolkien effectively stifled 50 years of innovation. His work was so revolutionary that the market couldn't deal with it. Readers wanted more books like Lord of the Rings, but other authors weren't ready to produce high fantasy yet. The only thing they could do was to try and do what Tolkien did. Now, this is interesting, okay? Because did he stifle? I mean, okay, look, Tolkien wasn't popular when he came out. At least not the Lord of the Rings. Hobbit had already been out, of course. And Lord of the Rings wasn't super popular. It did get more of its following in the 60s, and it came out in the 50s. So it took about a decade. And then with the 60s coming around, and you get all this adult fantasy collection, the Ballantine Adult Fantasy Collection, which is essentially republishing older stuff that kind of fits in line with Tolkien. Now, this is kind of Sanderson saying that Tolkien is so different from everything else. Now, Tolkien is the best, in my opinion. I'm not going to say he's not. I think he's the best. He's my favorite author. And he's so good, and he reads so good even today. But Tolkien was also educated, if that makes sense. He was educated in a lot of things and he made his that makes his world feel more alive. And he spent a lot of his time making his world feel more alive. The Lord of the Rings is just a glimpse of his legendarium. But he also had read other things, right? I mean, you can read an early Tolkien poem, and it's She, right? Read William Morris, or She by H. Rider Haggard, for those unaware, right? But read William Morris, read Beowulf, right? This is all stuff that was around. So, I mean, like, Tolkien didn't just create all this stuff whole cloth. And Sanderson is not really saying that, but he kind of is falling into that trap, I feel like. And he's kind of correct to a point as well. He's basically saying, I think he's missing the point here. Did Tolkien really create a problem, or is that just consumerism that created the problem? Essentially, like, wow, this sold, let's make more of this. And so then you get the Sword of Shannara, which is like the big first Tolkien copycat, I would say. And that came out in 77. Okay. That's over 20 years after The Lord of the Rings. This is not overnight. Okay. Epic fantasy does not blow up until, I would say, the 80s. And that's when things you get like Dragonlance as well. What a lot of people think of as fantasy doesn't really come about until the 80s and into the 90s, when it starts taking more of its form as recognizable today. But of course, that's just epic fantasy as well. There's a lot of other fantasy that's arguably better, but at least is different. That has been around for a while, and it was still around when Tolkien was writing this stuff, right? I mean, you can go read stuff contemporary with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And it's not going to read like The Lord of the Rings in a lot of ways, though The Broken Sword does have some similarities. That's by Paul Anderson. But you can go read something like Fritz Leiber's, like Fall from the Great Master. That's secondary world fantasy. That's high fantasy by this definition. It is secondary world. Okay. And that came out in 1939. Right. It's not what we call high fantasy. It's normally what we call sword and sorcery, because that's a better label for it. But it's high fantasy, technically. Right. So, anyways, so his work was so revolutionary, the market couldn't deal with it. Readers wanted more books like Lord of the Rings, but authors weren't ready to produce high fantasy yet. The only thing they could do is try and do what Tolkien did, and that's correct. Okay, he gets to a point here that is true. I was having this conversation, or as part of it, slightly on the Unabridged Burners Discord today, and I've said it before that a lot of fantasy writers are essentially making copies of a copy of a copy, and that third copy is essentially Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Someone copied that, and then someone else copied the copy, right? And they're missing a lot. They're missing a lot of what made Tolkien so good and still makes Tolkien so good, right? They're writing more into a box. Sanderson mentions earlier, it's still connected with like sci-fi and mythology and stuff, and like that's the point. Okay, that's why it was good. Okay, Tolkien is connected to mythology, and acting like he's not is missing the point again. Okay, Tolkien is connected to mythology, and that's why it works so well. Okay, Sanderson often misses that point, I feel like, in his own writing. He connects it more to science, which is not the point of fantasy at all, actually. So, um, I like Sanderson, by the way, but so he says, but they didn't do what Tolkien did. They didn't create a new world with its own mythology, its own society, its own technology, its own races and creatures. This wasn't their fault, they just weren't ready to jump to that level. So instead, they applied their considerable creativity toward copying Tolkien instead of creating true high fantasy. Everyone created more low fantasy, but they used Tolkien's world as a base instead of our own. The result was kind of tainting of the entire genre, a Tolkienizing. Fantasy didn't mean the genre where the author creates his or her own unique setting. It meant the genre where the books include elves, dwarves, wizards, and quests. And that's fair, but again, that's more of an 80s problem. That's more of a 90s problem. That's more of a I want to write fantasy that way problem. And you don't have to read it. And it does, and a lot of it's not good. You're right. So I mean, like, and some of it is fine, right? But it's not great art, I guess you could say. It's very much derivative, right? And derivative doesn't mean terrible, right? Gene Wolfe would be very forgiving here, right? He is in the best introduction to the mountains. But yeah, he's got a point, I guess, that including elves, dwarves. He says dwarfs actually, which is one knock down for Sanderson here. He says dwarfs. I prefer the word dwarves. Thank you. Wizards and quests, and that's like kind of a D&D type of fantasy. What we'd probably call that today. But it was pretty common back in like something like the 80s, which again is very specific though. It's the 80s, and Brandon Sanderson here is kind of fudging his timeline a bunch. I think it would. It's again just a short blog post, but a lot more nuances maybe required here. It says you probably know this already, but I ask you to think what would have happened if there hadn't been a Tolkien. What would have happened to fantasy? Well, there'd probably be more sword and sorcery, but maybe not. You have the same problem in sword and sorcery, though, right? And as everyone's sitting here saying, "Wow, Robert E. Howard, he's so amazing." Now there are a lot of people out there who worship Robert E. Howard, and I'm not one of them, even though I very much enjoy his works. And they copied Robert E. Howard, and you got these colonins, and those mostly happened in the 70s, and you get a little bit into the 80s, and then you have that. That's one of the reasons Tolkien took off, not just because he was good, but because there was a bunch of crap that was copying Robert E. Howard, right? And then you get people copying Tolkien, okay? And then anytime you copy anyone, you miss a lot of it. You're just missing the point, okay? You should try again. So I'm not saying you failed completely. You just get another try, right? And so I mean, like he kind of does. He misses that, right? Perhaps it would have continued in its vein of low fantasy dominating, and yet maybe Le Guin and others would have still written their books, learning to create their own worlds without being forced to deal with Tolkien's shadow. Like the caveman learning to harness fire, how to develop it, make it their tool. The authors would have had to learn how to write fantasy books on their own, and I imagine they have. Maybe that's not the most popular stuff out there. But there's some really good. I've read really good fantasy from probably just about every decade of the 20th century, right? Are some of them influenced by Tolkien? Probably. Are some of them definitely not? Yes, right? I mean, and so like, and they're there's very, 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 very good stuff out there. It just requires an author who is kind of in tune with themselves and kind of in tune with a lot of other things. And this is, I think, a point he's going to get to right now. But for better or worse, we're stuck with Tolkien. Many brilliant works were created in the Tolkien era, works I enjoyed and still think are examples of excellent writing. I don't know what he means by Tolkien era here. I think he might mean the copies of like, late 70s, 80s. I just wonder how much more creative, more powerful, more original they could have been if dear Grandpa Tolkien hadn't come along and given us the light bulb. So I think he's giving too much credit to Tolkien here. I think he's giving it kind of properly, right? Like, because he writes epic fantasy, which Tolkien is the guy, right? He is essentially the messiah of epic fantasy. Is he of fantasy in general? No. And I'm not going to knock Tolkien. I love Tolkien. I think he's extremely important, right? But it was a thing here. It's what he says. I can't remember where it is. But there's a thing that he made me think of right here. But they didn't do what Tolkien did. They didn't create a new world with its own mythology, its own society, its own technology, its own races and creatures. Tolkien didn't either in some ways. The elves are not his creation. Their version is his vision. Same with dwarves. Okay, hobbits are essentially his creation. Orcs are pretty much his creation as well. But he's getting a lot of this stuff from older themes. But what he does do, and this is what makes Tolkien feel very real, is it is the myth aspect. He very much is making his work Christian, though he veils it very well. Christian myth, I should say, too. And it's also, he's also philologically involved in his world, right? He developed those languages for decades, okay? And so when they show up in his work, heck, he probably changed it afterwards, but it feels real because he has his language. And so this is another problem that Sanderson doesn't touch on specifically, but there's a lot of people who are like, wow, Tolkien had Elvish, right? Like, so I got to make my own fantasy language, and it's garbage. Why? Because no one's a linguist, right? Or if they are a linguist, they're not as good as Tolkien. Tolkien, who was a philologist and knew language like the back of his hand, right? You know what I mean? And he knew the intricacies of it that most linguists probably wouldn't even know. And so, and you're right, and he developed that over a long time. He didn't just develop Elvish. He was like, oh, Sindarin, and it's related to Quenya in this way, and it comes from primitive Quindian in this way, and it's related to Telerin, and it's related to blah 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 blah, right? And this is how Adunaic is related to stuff in Westron and Kuzdul and stuff like that. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff moving parts there that Tolkien understood, and so he created it, and he actually does a really good job of not hitting you over the head with it and making it just about that. But Tolkien does do a good job because he takes some reality in a lot of ways. I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't do when they're getting these fantasy worlds is they don't know enough about reality. Reality is stranger than fiction is a saying, and that's cliche, but it's true in a lot of ways. Right? And you can get a lot of inspiration from reality. And Tolkien, very specifically, he did early Germanic stuff. Right, that was like his bread and butter. And then again, like I said, also Christian myth. And so, yeah, I just think it's interesting. Brandon Sanderson essay. I'm going to title it here "How Tolkien Ruined Fantasy" because the other title doesn't really work. And I've talked about Sanderson on this channel before, especially if magic systems aren't magic. I talked about Sanderson with DJ Butler, who wrote Magic Systems Aren't Magic. I just thought I'd talk about this. Again, it's really short. I will link it down below since no one will probably be able to find it otherwise. Let me know your thoughts. Again, am I being too harsh? I'm not trying to be harsh on Sanderson. There's probably more nuance here. Again, this I just read this and then commented. So Raph, right? If you want to make a video, go ahead. But anyways, Liam from Liam's Lysing. Again, this was How Tolkien Ruined Fantasy by Brandon Sanderson, and I'll catch you next time.